Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the mountains. For 30 years, Henrie Daws kept hers locked away where no one could find it. She lived quietly in Calico Ridge, Montana, raised her German shepherd, and never talked about the night someone vanished into those hills. Then a well-dressed stranger stepped off the afternoon train, carrying an expensive leather suitcase. Her dog lunged at that bag and tore it open right there on the platform. What spilled out wasn't money or contraband. It was something from a tragedy the whole town thought was gone forever. No, the sheriff wants answers, the stranger wants revenge, and Henrie must face the truth she buried 3 decades ago. What did her dog smell that connected this city man to an old mountain disappearance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains around Calico Ridge held their secrets close, the way old men hold photographs of people they've lost. Henrie Daws understood that better than most. She'd lived in these hills for more than 30 years, watching the town below shrink as the mines gave out and the timber companies moved on. What remained was a stubborn handful of folks who couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Even as their porches sagged and their paint peeled and the wind came down from the high peaks with nothing to stop it. Henrie's cabin sat 1.5 miles up the ridge, accessible only by a narrow trail that switched back through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. She'd built most of it herself over the years, adding a room here, a covered porch there, until it became something more than shelter. It became the physical manifestation of her solitude. The logs were weathered gray, chinked with moss and mud. The roof was corrugated tin that sang when the rain came. Inside, everything was spare and functional. A wood stove, a narrow bed, shelves lined with mason jars full of preserves and dried beans, and a single rocking chair positioned near the window where she could watch the valley. She was 62 years old, though the mountains had aged her face beyond that. Her hands were rough and capable, scarred from decades of work. Her hair, once dark as creekstones, had gone mostly silver, and she kept it braided down her back. She moved with the economy of someone who'd spent a lifetime carrying loads up steep trails. No wasted motion, every step deliberate. Her eyes, though, those still held something young, something that hadn't quite given up. Bandit, her German shepherd, was 7 years old and the only living thing she spoke to with any regularity. She'd found him as a pup, abandoned near the old logging road, and raised him on scraps and affection. He was protective without being vicious, intelligent enough to read her moods, and loyal in the way that only dogs can be. When she walked, he walked beside her. When she sat on the porch in the evenings, he lay at her feet. They understood each other. Her life followed rhythms that hadn't changed in years. She woke before dawn, started the fire, made coffee strong enough to strip paint. She tended a small garden in the summer, hunted deer and elk in the fall, trapped marten and fox in the winter. Once a month, she'd take furs and jerky down to Calico Ridge and trade them at Opal Drummond's general store for flour, sugar, salt, and ammunition. She spoke only when necessary, never lingered, and returned to the mountain before anyone could ask too many questions. The townspeople had their theories about her. Some said she'd lost a husband to the mines. Others claimed she'd killed a man and fled up here to hide. A few of the older folks remembered her arriving in 1893, young and hollow-eyed, and taking work at the logging camp before disappearing into the high country. But memories fade and people die. And eventually Henrie Daws became just another fixture of the landscape. Odd, solitary, and essentially unknowable. Sheriff Tobias Kern had been the law in Calico Ridge for 23 years. He was pushing 70 now, thick around the middle, with a face like carved sandstone and eyes that missed very little. He'd known Henrie longer than most, though known was perhaps too strong a word. He'd watched her from a distance, noted her patterns, and left her alone because she never caused trouble. But he remembered things. He remembered when she'd first come to town, remembered the questions folks had asked about a missing surveyor, remembered how quickly those questions had been buried. Deputy Lyle Pritchard was young, 26, and earnest in a way that Kern had long since lost. He'd grown up in Calico Ridge, the son of a former deputy who died of pneumonia when Lyle was 15. He took the job seriously, maybe too seriously, always wanting to dig deeper, understand more. He treated Henrie with a kind of respectful curiosity, tipping his hat when he saw her in town. Never pressing but always watching, Opal Drummond ran the general store. A tall woman in her late 50s with iron-grey hair pinned in a severe bun, and a voice that carried. She knew everyone's business because they told it to her over the counter while buying flour or lamp oil. She'd run that store with her husband Horace until he died 10 years back, and she'd kept it going alone ever since. She had opinions about everything and shared them freely. About Henrie, she said, "That woman's got ghosts." But she said it without malice, the way you'd comment on the weather. It was mid-September when Henrie made the trek down to town for supplies. The aspens were turning gold, and the air had that particular clarity that comes just before the first snow. She had Bandit with her, as always, and a pack full of marten pelts, prime winter fur, worth good money. The trail down was steep but familiar, and she descended with the loose-hipped stride of someone who'd walked it 1,000 times. Calico Ridge looked smaller every time she saw it. The main street was dirt, rutted and dusty, lined with false-fronted buildings that had been grand once, but now leaned slightly, their paint gone to ghosts of color. The old stamp mill sat silent at the north end of town, its machinery rusted and still. The train depot was the only building that saw regular maintenance, because the twice-weekly train was the town's last real connection to the outside world. Henrie tied Bandit to the post outside the general store and went in. The bell above the door jangled. Opal looked up from her ledger and nodded. "Henrie." Opal. "Got those pelts?" Henrie laid them on the counter. Opal examined them with a practiced eye, running her fingers through the fur, checking for bald spots or poor curing. She nodded approvingly. "Fine work. I'll give you standard rate." They settled the transaction in silence. Henrie never haggled, and she took her credit in flour, salt, coffee, and a box of rifle cartridges. As Opal wrapped the goods in brown paper, she said without looking up, "Train comes through in 20 minutes. You might want to clear out before then." "Gets crowded." Henrie paused. Opal never gave advice without reason. "Someone coming?" "Don't know." "Just saying." Henrie took her parcels and left. She should have headed straight back up the mountain. That's what she would have done any other day. But something in Opal's tone had unsettled her, and instead of leaving, she found herself walking toward the depot with Bandit at her side. The platform was empty, except for a few crates waiting to be loaded. The tracks stretched east and west, 2 lines of iron disappearing into the distance. Henrie sat on a bench in the shade, told Bandit to lie down, and waited. She told herself she was just resting before the climb. She told herself it didn't matter who got off the train. She heard it before she saw it, the distant whistle, then the rhythmic chuff of the engine. The train rounded the bend, a ribbon of black smoke trailing behind it. It was a small train, just an engine, a freight car, and a single passenger car. It slowed, brakes squealing, and came to a stop with a hiss of steam. The conductor stepped down, placed a stool, and stood aside. For a moment no one emerged. Then a man appeared in the doorway. He was maybe 40, dressed in a dark suit and bowler hat, city clothes, expensive. He carried a leather suitcase in one hand and a smaller traveling case in the other. His face was clean-shaven, his shoes polished. He looked utterly out of place in Calico Ridge, and he knew it. His eyes swept the platform, taking in the dusty street, the sagging buildings, and finally, Henrie, sitting in the shade with her dog. Their eyes met for just a second. Something flickered in his expression, recognition maybe, or surprise, but it was gone before she could be sure. He stepped down onto the platform. The conductor handed him another bag, then climbed back aboard. The train gave a lurch and began to pull away, leaving the stranger standing alone with his luggage. Sheriff Kern appeared from the direction of his office, walking slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet from the stranger and hooked his thumbs in his belt. "Help you with something?" The stranger set down his bags and extended a hand. "Arthur Bellamy. I'm here on personal business." Kern didn't shake the offered hand. "What kind of personal business brings a man to Calico Ridge?" Family business, Sheriff. Private family business. Ain't much private in a town this size. Arthur Bellamy's smile was thin. Nevertheless, Henrie should have left then. Should have gathered her things and headed back up the trail. But something held her in place, that flicker of recognition she'd seen, or thought she'd seen, in the stranger's eyes. Bandit, who'd been lying quietly at her feet, suddenly lifted his head. His ears went forward. A low rumble started in his chest. "Easy," Henrie murmured, reaching down to touch his head. But Bandit wasn't listening. He was staring at the stranger's luggage with an intensity that raised the hair on Henrie's arms. His lip curled back, showing teeth. "Bandit down," the dog lunged. It happened so fast that no one had time to react. Bandit hit the leather suitcase with his full weight, jaws closing around the handle. The case flew from Arthur Bellamy's hand and hit the platform, bursting open. Clothes exploded across the weathered boards, shirts, trousers, undergarments. A shaving kit clattered and spilled. And from a hidden compartment in the lining, something else fell out, a photograph. Small, faded, water-damaged at the edges. It landed face up in a shaft of sunlight. Henrie saw it from where she sat. Saw it clearly, and the world lurched sideways. The photograph showed two people standing on a rocky outcrop with mountains behind them. A young woman with dark hair and a cautious smile. A man in surveyor's clothes, one arm around the woman's shoulders, looking at the camera with the kind of open-faced happiness that belongs only to people who don't yet know how the story ends. Henrie knew that photograph. She'd seen it taken 30 years ago, on a ridge called Broken Spine. The young woman in the photograph was her. The man was Jackson Lyle, and Jackson Lyle had been dead for 3 decades. For a moment, the world was very still. The photograph lay on the platform between them, a piece of the past made suddenly, impossibly present. Henrie couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Arthur Bellamy stared at the scattered contents of his suitcase, his face gone white, then red. He dropped to his knees and began gathering his belongings with quick, angry movements. When his hand closed around the photograph, he looked up, and his eyes found Henrie. "You," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Sheriff Kern moved between them, one hand raised. Everyone just settled down. "Henrie, get your dog under control." She realized Bandit was still growling, still focused on the stranger. She grabbed his collar and pulled him back, her hands shaking. "Bandit, heel, heel." The dog reluctantly obeyed, but his hackles remained raised. Arthur stood, clutching the photograph and a handful of clothes. His composure had cracked. "That's her," he said, pointing at Henrie. "That's the woman in the picture. Ask her. Ask her what she knows about Jackson Lyle." Henrie's mouth was dry. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the mountains where no one could find her, but her legs wouldn't obey. Kern was looking at her now, his weathered face unreadable. "Henrie, you know this man?" She shook her head. "Never seen him before. But you know the name Jackson Lyle. It wasn't a question, and lying would only make it worse." She nodded once, barely. "That was a long time ago. 30 years, Arthur said." His voice shook. 30 years since my uncle disappeared in these mountains. 30 years since someone saw him last. And here you are, the woman from his photograph, standing right in front of me." The platform was no longer empty. Word had spread the way it always did in small towns. People were drifting over from the general store, from the boarding house, from the saloon. Opal Drummond stood in the doorway of her store, arms crossed. Deputy Pritchard had appeared from somewhere, young face uncertain. Kern held up both hands. "Everyone clear out. This is official business. Lyle, help Mr. Bellamy with his bags. Get him settled at the boarding house. I'm not going anywhere until—" "You're going to the boarding house," Kern said, his voice hardening. "You're upset and you've had a long journey. We'll talk about all this once you've had a chance to rest and collect yourself." "Understood?" Arthur's jaw worked, but he nodded. Lyle gathered the scattered clothes and repacked the suitcase, while Arthur stood there gripping the photograph like it might dissolve if he let go. Kern turned to Henrie. "You and I need to talk. My office, now." She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him she'd done nothing wrong, but that wasn't entirely true, was it? She'd known something happened to Jackson Lyle. She'd known, and she'd said nothing. She followed Kern down the street, Bandit pressed against her leg. Behind them, she could hear the murmur of voices, the town already starting to talk. The sheriff's office was a small building with a desk, 2 chairs, and a gun rack on the wall. Kern shut the door and gestured to a chair. Henrie sat. Bandit lay at her feet, still tense. Kern lowered himself into the chair behind the desk with a sigh. He took off his hat and set it on the desk, ran a hand through his thinning hair. For a long moment he said nothing. "You going to tell me the truth?" he finally asked. "I don't know what he wants from me. I think you do." Jackson Lyle was a surveyor, came through here in the spring of 1893. He was mapping timber claims for a company out of Helena. And then come June he disappeared. Nobody ever found a body, but his camp was torn up, blood on the rocks. I was just a deputy then, barely 20 years old, but I remember. We searched those mountains for 2 weeks, nothing. Henrie stared at her hands. They were still shaking. "Did you know him?" Kern asked. "Yes." "How well?" "Well enough." Kern leaned back in his chair. "There were questions at the time. Folks said you'd been seen with him. Folks said maybe you knew more than you let on. But there wasn't any evidence. And after a while, the company stopped asking questions and we closed the case. Accident in the backcountry happens. It wasn't an accident. The words were out before she could stop them." Kern's eyes narrowed. "What makes you say that?" Henrie closed her eyes. She'd kept this buried for 3 decades, and now it was rising up like something long drowned. "His camp was destroyed. You said so yourself. You found blood. That's not an accident. Could have been a bear. Could have been a fall. It wasn't. Then what was it?" She opened her eyes and looked at him. "I don't know. But I know Jackson wouldn't have been careless. He knew those mountains. He wouldn't have put himself in danger. You were close to him. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. How close? Close enough that I should have gone to you when he disappeared. Close enough that I've carried the guilt of not doing it for 30 years. Kern was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he said, "Why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid. I was young and stupid and scared, and I didn't know what had happened to him. I thought maybe if I just kept my mouth shut, it would all go away. And it did. Until today, this Arthur Bellamy. He said Jackson was his uncle. I didn't know Jackson had family. Well, he did. And now one of them is here, asking questions. Questions I'm going to have to answer." Kern picked up his hat and turned it in his hands. "I need you to tell me everything you know. Everything that happened that summer. And I need the truth, Henrie. Not what you think I want to hear. The truth," she told him. Not everything. She couldn't bear to tell him everything, but enough. She told him about meeting Jackson at the logging camp, about how they'd talked in the evenings when the work was done, how he'd been different from the other men, educated and gentle, interested in the world beyond timber and mining, how they'd started meeting in secret because Jackson was engaged to a woman back east and didn't want complications. She told him about the plans they'd made, whispered plans in the dark. Jackson was going to finish his survey, go back east, break off the engagement. He'd come back for her, and they'd leave together, start fresh somewhere new. She told him about the last time she saw Jackson alive. He'd been excited, distracted. He'd told her he'd discovered something in his work, something important, but he wouldn't say what. He said he needed to check one more thing up on Broken Spine Ridge. He'd be back by morning. He never came back. She told Kern how she'd waited, how she'd finally gone looking and found the camp torn apart, the tent collapsed, equipment scattered, blood on the stones, and Jackson's surveying tools snapped and broken. She told him she'd taken one thing, Jackson's pocket watch still ticking, lying in the dirt, and then she'd run back down the mountain and never spoken of it to anyone. When she finished, Kern was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You still have the watch?" "Yes. I'm going to need to see it." "Why?" "What good will it do now?" "Because Arthur Bellamy is going to keep asking questions, and if I don't have answers, he's going to make trouble. The kind of trouble this town doesn't need." Kern stood up. "Go home, Henrie. Get the watch and bring it to me tomorrow. And stay away from Bellamy. Let me handle this." She stood, legs unsteady. "What are you going to tell him?" "The truth, as much of it as I know, which isn't much." He met her eyes. "But I'll tell you this. That photograph didn't just fall out of a suitcase by accident. Your dog knew something was in there. Dogs don't react like that for no reason. Henrie looked down at Bandit. The dog gazed back at her, calm now, but still alert. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe there's more to this than an old tragedy. Maybe Arthur Bellamy came here for a reason. And maybe we're all about to find out what happens when you dig up the past. Henrie left the office and walked through town with Bandit at her side. People watched her pass, but no one spoke. By the time she reached the trailhead, the sun was low in the west, and her shadow stretched long across the ground. She climbed the mountain in the fading light, her mind turning over everything that had happened. The photograph, Arthur Bellamy's rage, the way Bandit had lunged at that suitcase, and underneath it all, a question she'd been afraid to ask for 30 years. What had Jackson discovered that had gotten him killed? Henrie didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind move through the pines and watching shadows shift across the ceiling. Bandit sensed her restlessness and stayed close, his warm bulk pressed against the side of the bed. When the first grey light of dawn touched the windows, she rose and lit the lamp. She pulled on her boots and went to the far corner of the cabin where the floorboards were loose. She'd hidden the pocket watch there 30 years ago and hadn't touched it since. The boards came up easily. Beneath them was a space just big enough for a small tin box. She lifted it out, her hands steady now, and set it on the table. The box was rusted at the edges. She opened it, and there, nested in a piece of oilcloth, was Jackson Lyle's pocket watch. It was silver, tarnished now, with an engraved case. She turned it over and read the inscription she'd memorized long ago. To J.L., with love and pride, Father. She opened the case. The watch had stopped, frozen, at 10 minutes past 8. Whether that was morning or evening, she'd never know. Looking at it brought everything back. Not just Jackson's face, though she could still see that clearly enough. His serious eyes, the way he smiled like he was surprised to find himself happy. But also the feeling of those months, the cautious hope, the sense that maybe, just maybe, her life could be something other than hard work and loneliness. She'd been 32 that summer, which felt old even then. She'd come west after her. Parents died, looking for work, looking for a place where no one knew her story. She'd found work at the logging camp, cooking for the crew, and she was good at it. The men left her alone because she made it clear she wanted to be left alone. Jackson had been different. He hadn't pushed, hadn't assumed. He'd just talked to her like she was someone worth talking to. He'd told her about books he'd read, places he'd seen. He'd asked her questions and actually listened to the answers. She'd fallen in love with him slowly, then all at once. And when he'd told her he felt the same, she'd allowed herself to believe it could work. Fool! She wrapped the watch back in the oilcloth and put it in her pocket. Then she made coffee, fed Bandit, and sat on the porch watching the sun rise over the valley. She needed to take the watch to Kern, but first she needed to understand what she was walking into. Arthur Bellamy hadn't come to Calico Ridge by accident. He'd come looking for answers, and he'd brought that photograph for a reason, which meant he already knew something. The question was, how much? She thought about the way Bandit had reacted to the suitcase. Dogs didn't behave that way without cause. Bandit had smelled something that triggered every protective instinct he had. What had been in that suitcase besides clothes and a photograph? She finished her coffee, told Bandit to stay, and headed down the mountain. The morning was cold and clear, the aspens bright gold against the dark green of the pines. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. She reached town just after 8. The street was quiet, most people still at breakfast. She went straight to the sheriff's office. Kern was at his desk, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. He looked up when she entered. "You bring it?" She took the watch from her pocket and laid it on the desk. Kern picked it up, examined it, opened the case, and studied the stopped hands. This was his? Yes. Where'd you find it? At his camp, the day after he disappeared. Kern set the watch down carefully. And you kept it all these years. Why? I don't know. Maybe I thought I'd need proof someday. Maybe I just couldn't let go. She paused. Has Bellamy said anything else? He came by last night, wanted to file a formal complaint, said you were involved in his uncle's death. That's insane. Maybe, but he's got that photograph, and now I've got this watch, and both of them put you right in the middle of things 30 years ago. Kern leaned back in his chair. I need you to be straight with me, Henrie. Is there anything else you're not telling me? Anything at all? She thought about the way Jackson had been that last day, distracted and excited. She thought about him saying he'd discovered something important. Jackson said he'd found something, some problem with the timber surveys. He wouldn't tell me what, but he said it was significant enough that he needed to verify it before he reported it. Kern's expression sharpened. What kind of problem? I don't know. He was working for Intermountain Timber, surveying their claims. He said something about the boundaries not matching up, but he didn't give me details. Intermountain Timber. Kern's voice was flat. You know them? They owned most of the timber rights around here back then. Big company out of Helena. They pulled out around 1895, sold off their claims. Haven't heard that name in years. He picked up the watch again, turning it over in his hands. If Jackson found irregularities in their surveys, that would have been worth a lot of money. Either to the company, if they wanted it buried, or to their competitors, if they wanted leverage. You think someone killed him over timber rights? I think men have been killed for less, and I think your friend was in a position to cause some powerful people a lot of trouble. He stood up. I'm going to talk to Bellamy, see what he knows about his uncle's work. You stay out of sight. Go home and let me handle this. I want to know what's happening, and I'll tell you when I know. But right now, you being visible just makes things more complicated. Trust me on this. Henrie nodded reluctantly. She left the office and started back toward the trail, but as she passed the boarding house, she saw Arthur Bellamy standing on the porch. He saw her too. For a moment they just looked at each other. Then he came down the steps and walked toward her. She should have kept walking, should have followed Kern's advice, but she stood her ground. Miss Daws. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. Mr. Bellamy, I need to talk to you. The sheriff said, I don't care what the sheriff said. My uncle disappeared 30 years ago, and you were the last person to see him alive. I think I'm owed an explanation. People were starting to notice them. Across the street, Opal Drummond had come out of the general store and was watching. Deputy Pritchard was standing near the saloon, uncertain whether to intervene. Henrie kept her voice low. I don't know what happened to your uncle. I wish I did, but I can't help you. Can't or won't. Both. Arthur's jaw tightened. He wrote about you in his journal. Did you know that? He called you H. He said you were different from anyone he'd ever met. He said he was going to leave his fiancée for you. The words hit her like a fist. He kept a journal. Of course he did. He was a surveyor. He documented everything. His work, his travels, and apparently his personal life too. I have it. I've read every word. Then you know I didn't hurt him. I know he trusted you. I know he told you things he shouldn't have. And I know he's dead, and you're still here. Arthur stepped closer. His last entry was dated June 14th, 1893. He wrote that he was meeting someone on Broken Spine Ridge, someone who claimed to have proof of what he'd suspected. He wrote, H says she has the evidence I need. That was you, wasn't it? Henrie's mind raced. No, I never said that. I didn't even know what he was investigating. Then who did? Who else knew? I don't know. You're lying. I'm not. Jackson told me he'd found something wrong with the surveys, but he never told me what, and I never claimed to have proof of anything. Someone else must have used my name. Arthur stared at her, searching her face for deception. Finally, he said, I'm going to find out what happened to him, with or without your help. And if I find out you were involved, if you had any part in his death, I'll make sure you pay for it. He turned and walked back to the boarding house, leaving Henrie standing in the street with her heart pounding and her hands clenched into fists. Someone had used her name to lure Jackson to his death. Someone had known about their relationship, had known enough to make Jackson believe she had evidence. And 30 years later, that someone was still out there. Henrie didn't go back to her cabin. Instead, She found herself walking to the old county records office, a small building behind the courthouse that smelled of dust and old paper. The clerk, a thin man named Walter Finch, looked up from his newspaper when she entered. "Help you with something, Miss Daws?" "I need to see land records from 1893, timber claims specifically." Finch raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He led her to a back room, lined with shelves full of ledgers and deed books. "What month?" "June, and maybe July." He pulled down several heavy volumes and set them on a table. "These cover the whole county. If you need help reading them, I can manage." He left her alone. She opened the first ledger and began working through the entries. The handwriting was cramped and faded, but she'd learned to read legal documents during her years at the logging camp. It was slow work. Most of the entries were routine, transfers of property, mining claims, timber rights. But as she moved into June 1893, she began to notice a pattern. Several small landowners had sold their timber rights to Intermountain Timber Company in a span of 2 weeks. The transactions were marked as voluntary sales, but the prices seemed low. She wrote down the names: Silas Greer, Thomas McCain, Ruth Holloway, Emil Larson. She didn't recognize most of them, but Silas Greer rang a bell. She remembered him vaguely from the logging camp, a prospector who'd been convinced his claim was worth a fortune. He'd been vocal about not selling, even when Intermountain offered him money, and then, according to the records, he'd sold anyway. On June 20th, 1893, 6 days after Jackson disappeared, she kept reading. At the back of the ledger, she found something else, a notation in different handwriting, smaller and harder to read. "Witnessed by TK. She turned pages, looking for other entries with the same witness. There were 3 more, all timber claim transfers, all to Intermountain Timber, all during the same 2-week period. She went back to Finch's desk. "Who was the deputy sheriff in 1893? Finch scratched his chin. "That'd be before my time. But I think Tobias Kern was a deputy back then. He's been around forever." The floor seemed to shift under her feet. Kern had witnessed the land transfers, which meant he'd known about them. Which meant what exactly? She thanked Finch and left. Her mind was churning. Kern had told her he'd investigated Jackson's disappearance. He'd told her they'd found nothing, but he'd never mentioned the land transfers. Never mentioned that Jackson had been investigating irregularities right up until he died. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe Kern had just been doing his job, witnessing legal documents. But Henrie had learned long ago that coincidences were rare in small towns. She headed back toward the sheriff's office, but before she got there, Deputy Pritchard stepped out of the general store and flagged her down. "Miss Daws, got a minute?" "Not really, no. Please." "It's about Mr. Bellamy." She stopped. Pritchard looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "What about him?" "He's been asking a lot of questions around town. About you, about his uncle, about what happened back in '93. Sheriff Kern told him to back off, but he's not listening. I'm worried he's going to cause trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind where people start taking sides. You know how it is. Stranger comes to town, starts stirring up old stories. Folks start remembering things that maybe aren't quite true." Pritchard lowered his voice. "My pa was a deputy back then, same time as Sheriff Kern. He died when I was young, but my ma still talks about those days. She said there was something strange about the whole Jackson-Lyle business. Said the investigation got shut down real quick. Orders from above. Orders from who? She doesn't know. But she said Pa wasn't happy about it. He kept notes, personal notes, separate from the official reports. She's still got them if you want to see." Henrie's heart was racing. "Yes, I want to see them. Come by tonight after dark. Don't want folks seeing you visit. Ma lives on the east edge of town, little white house with a blue door. You know it?" She nodded. She knew every house in Calico Ridge, even if she'd never been inside most of them. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. I don't know what's in those notes, and I don't know if they'll help. But if someone killed Mr. Bellamy's uncle, they should answer for it. Even if it was 30 years ago." He tipped his hat and walked away. Henrie stood there for a moment, thinking. Then she went back to the sheriff's office. Kern was standing by the window, looking out at the street. He turned when she entered. I thought I told you to go home. I went to the county records office. His expression hardened. Why? Because I wanted to see what Jackson was investigating, and I found it.
Land transfers.
4 of them, all to Intermountain Timber, all right after Jackson disappeared. And you witnessed 3 of them. Kern's face didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. That was my job. I was a deputy. Deputies witness legal documents. Did you know Jackson was looking into those transfers? I knew there'd been some questions about property boundaries. That's not unusual in timber country. Surveys get confused, claims overlap. Happens all the time, but Jackson thought it was more than that. He thought someone was forcing people to sell. Jackson thought a lot of things. He was young and idealistic, and he saw conspiracies everywhere. Kern moved away from the window and sat at his desk. Look, Henry, I understand you're upset. And I understand Arthur Bellamy showing up has dredged up a lot of old feelings. But you need to let this go. Why? Because digging into the past doesn't change what happened. It just makes things worse for everyone. Someone used my name to lure Jackson to his death. Don't you think I have a right to know who? I think you have a right to live your life without dragging yourself through hell over something you can't change. His voice softened. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I was part of something. You're thinking I knew more than I let on. Maybe that's even true. But I was 20 years old, Henry. I was a deputy following orders. And whatever happened to Jackson Lyle, I didn't have any part in it. Then who did? I don't know. And I stopped trying to find out a long time ago because it was made very clear to me that my job was to keep the peace, not ask uncomfortable questions. That's how things worked back then. Maybe it was wrong, but that's how it was. Henry studied his face. He looked tired, older than his years. You're protecting someone. I'm protecting this town. There's a difference, is there? Kern didn't answer. After a moment, Henry turned and left. Outside, the sun was high, and the street was busy with people going about their daily business. None of them knew what she knew. None of them understood that the ground they walked on was built over old lies. She went back to the trailhead and climbed toward her cabin, but she didn't go inside. Instead, she sat on the porch with Bandit and waited for night to fall. When full dark came, she made her way back down to town, moving quietly, staying off the main street. The house with the blue door was at the edge of Calico Ridge, small and neat with a garden in front. A lamp burned in the window. She knocked softly. The door opened and Deputy Pritchard's mother, a small woman with grey hair and sharp eyes, gestured her inside. You're Henrie Daws. Yes. Ma'am, Lyle says you want to see my husband's notes. If you're willing to share them. The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she said, my husband died wondering what really happened to that surveyor. He never got over it. If his notes can help you find the truth, then yes, I'm willing. She led Henry to a small room and brought out a wooden box. Inside were several journals, their pages yellowed and brittle. These are from 1893. Take your time. Henry opened the first journal and began to read. And with each page, the picture became clearer and more damning. The deputy's notes were meticulous. Each entry was dated and written in careful script. Henry read by lamplight, while Mrs. Pritchard made tea in the kitchen, giving her privacy. June 15th, 1893. Received report of missing surveyor. Jackson Lyle, last seen heading toward Broken Spine Ridge 3 days prior. Organized search party with Sheriff Morrison and Deputy Kern. Found camp destroyed. Evidence of violence. No body recovered. June 16th, 1893. Continued search. Located surveying equipment damaged. Found blood on rocks near camp. No sign of Lyle. Sheriff Morrison believes animal attack, possibly bear. Deputy Kern agrees. I am not convinced. June 17th, 1893. Interviewed workers at logging camp. Several confirm Lyle was investigating irregularities in timber surveys. One woman, Cook would not give name, appeared distressed when questioned. She knew Lyle personally. Sheriff ordered me not to press her. Henry's hands trembled as she read that entry. The cook who wouldn't give her name. That was her, June 18th, 1893. Met with representatives from Intermountain Timber Company. They expressed concern about Lyle's disappearance, but seemed more interested in recovering his survey notes than finding his body. They claimed notes contained proprietary information. Sheriff turned over all documents found at camp. I protested. Was told to stand down. June 20th, 1893, Silas Greer came to office this morning. Claims he was threatened, forced to sign over his timber rights to Intermountain. He was agitated, possibly intoxicated. Sheriff dismissed his complaint. Greer left town same day. When I asked Sheriff about following up, he told me case was closed, orders from territorial government. Pressure from above to let it go. June 25th, 1893. Deputy Kern witnessed several land transfers this week. All to Intermountain timber, all at prices well below market value. When I questioned the timing, Kern said it was coincidence. I do not believe in coincidences. July 2nd, 1893. Sheriff Morrison informed me that Jackson Lyle case is officially closed. Ruled accidental death due to animal attack. No further investigation authorized. When I objected, I was warned that questioning official findings could cost me my job. I have a wife and child. I cannot afford to lose this position. But I will keep these notes. Someday, someone may need to know the truth. The entries continued sporadically after that, but they were brief and circumspect. The deputy had clearly been afraid of repercussions. The last entry about the case was dated August 14th, 1893, heard rumors that Jackson Lyle's fiancée back east hired a private investigator. Investigation went nowhere. Company had already closed ranks. Whatever Lyle discovered died with him. Henry closed the journal and sat in silence. Mrs. Pritchard appeared in the doorway. "Did you find what you needed?" "I found evidence of a cover-up. Your husband was right to be suspicious." The old woman nodded slowly. "He never forgave himself for not pushing harder. He said someone should have fought for that young man, and he let fear keep him silent." She paused. "Don't make the same mistake he did." Henry thanked her and left. It was past midnight and the town was dark and quiet. She moved through the shadows, thinking about what she'd learned. The case had been deliberately buried. Evidence had been suppressed, and people who objected had been silenced, but the journal hadn't named the person or persons who'd killed Jackson. It only showed that powerful people had benefited from his death. She needed to find the actual murder weapon, not a literal weapon, but the paper trail that would connect someone specific to the crime. And she knew where to look. The old Intermountain timber office stood at the edge of town, a two-story building that had been abandoned for almost 30 years. The company had pulled out of Calico Ridge in 1895, consolidating their operations elsewhere. The building had stood empty ever since, too far gone to renovate, not quite derelict enough to tear down. Henry had walked past it 1,000 times without thinking about it. Now she studied it with new eyes. If there were records, if there was proof of what Intermountain had done, it would be in there. She couldn't go now. It was too exposed, and dawn was coming. She'd have to wait for tomorrow night. But first, she needed to talk to Arthur Bellamy. She found him the next morning at the boarding house, sitting in the small dining room with a cup of coffee and his uncle's journal open in front of him. He looked up when she entered, his expression wary. "Miss Daws, Mr. Bellamy, we need to talk. Somewhere private." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. They went outside and walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open scrubland. When they were far enough from listening ears, Henry stopped. "You were right," she said. "Someone used my name to lure your uncle to his death. But it wasn't me. How do I know that? Because I'm going to help you find out who actually did it. But I need to know everything that's in that journal. Everything your uncle wrote about his investigation." Arthur was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Why should I trust you?" "Because I loved him, and because I've spent 30 years living with the guilt of not speaking up when I should have. I can't bring him back, but maybe I can finally give him justice." Something in her voice must have convinced him. His shoulders sagged slightly. "All right. But if I find out you're lying to me, you won't." They found a place to sit on some rocks overlooking the valley. Arthur opened the journal and began to read aloud. Jackson had been thorough. He documented every survey he conducted, every property line he verified, and he'd started noticing problems immediately. boundaries that didn't match the recorded deeds, claims that overlapped, timber stands that had been surveyed multiple times, each survey showing different acreage. At first, he'd assumed it was simple incompetence. Surveyors made mistakes, especially in rough terrain. But as he continued his work, he'd realized it was systematic. Someone was deliberately falsifying surveys to make certain properties appear less valuable than they were. Then Intermountain would buy them cheap, and a new survey, accurate this time, would reveal the true worth. It was fraud, plain and simple. And it was worth a fortune. Jackson had written, "The pattern is unmistakable. Someone inside the company is working with someone local who has access to the deed records. They alter the surveys before they're filed, then use those altered documents to pressure landowners into selling. Once the sale is complete, the true survey is filed. I estimate Intermountain has acquired nearly 10,000 acres through this scheme at roughly half the fair market value." Did he name anyone? Henrie asked. He had suspicions. He wrote about a man named Horace Drummond, who was on the county council and seemed unusually involved in the land transfers. And he mentioned that the deputy who witnessed most of the sales, someone with the initials TK, was always present when documents were filed. Tobias Kern. You know him? He's the sheriff now. He was a deputy back then. Arthur's eyes narrowed. And you're just telling me this now? I didn't know he was involved. I thought he was just doing his job. But I checked the records yesterday. He witnessed 3 of the land transfers that happened right after your uncle disappeared. Then he's either complicit or he knows who is. Probably both. Henrie took a breath. There's something else. The old Intermountain office is still standing. If there are company ledgers, if there's a paper trail showing payments, or who was in on the scheme, they'd be there. You want to break in. I want to find the truth. Don't you? Arthur looked at the journal in his hands, then at the town below. Finally he nodded. Tonight, after midnight. Meet me at the north end of town, by the old stamp mill. Agreed. They went their separate ways. Henrie spent the day at her cabin preparing. She packed a satchel with a lantern, matches, and a crowbar. She sharpened her knife. She tried not to think about what she was about to do. Breaking into an abandoned building to search for evidence of a crime committed 3 decades ago. But she kept thinking about what Mrs. Pritchard had said. Don't make the same mistake he did. Don't let fear keep you silent. When dark came, she left Bandit at the cabin and made her way down the mountain. Arthur was waiting by the stamp mill, dressed in dark clothes and carrying his own lantern. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." They crossed the empty street and approached the old timber office. The front door was boarded up, but around back they found a window with broken glass. Arthur cleared away the remaining shards and climbed through. Henrie followed. Inside it smelled of mold and rot. Moonlight filtered through holes in the roof. They lit their lanterns, and the light pushed back the darkness to reveal an office frozen in time. Desks still in place. Papers scattered across the floor, shelves lined with ledgers. "Start searching," Arthur said. "We're looking for anything dated 1893, especially June or July." They worked methodically, moving from room to room. Most of the documents were routine business records, timber sales, payroll, equipment purchases. But in a back office, behind a filing cabinet, Henrie found something else, a leather-bound ledger marked "Confidential." She opened it. The pages were damaged by water and age, but the writing was still legible. And what she read made her blood run cold. The ledger contained payments, not official salaries or contracts, but a separate list marked "Consulting Services." The entries were coded, but the pattern was clear enough. Regular payments to individuals identified only by initials, HD, and TK, and someone marked as VD. "Arthur, look at this." He came over and studied the page. Payment records. These amounts are substantial, hundreds of dollars per month. HD has to be Horace Drummond. TK is Tobias Kern. But who's VD? Arthur flipped through more pages. Here, June 1893. A large payment to VD, $5,000, marked as "Special Services Rendered." He looked up at Henrie. "That's a fortune. What kind of special services would be worth that much?" the kind you don't want documented in official records. They kept searching. In another office, they found a shipping manifest dated June 12, 1893. It listed a delivery to B.S. Ridge, Broken Spine Ridge. The items: 3 crates of blasting powder, fuses, and detonation caps. "They were mining up there?" Arthur asked. "Not that I ever heard of. The ridge was too unstable for deep mining. That's why it was called Broken Spine. The rock formations looked like shattered vertebrae." Henrie stared at the manifest. What if they weren't mining? What if they were staging an accident? An explosion would destroy evidence, make a death look like a mining accident, and explain away the blood and the destroyed camp. They looked at each other in the lamplight, the full picture beginning to emerge. Jackson had discovered the fraud. Someone had lured him to the ridge, using Henrie's name, someone who knew about their relationship. And then they'd killed him and tried to make it look like an accident. "We need to find out who VD is," Arthur said. "That person received payment right around the time my uncle was killed. That can't be coincidence. Horace Drummond is dead, has been for 10 years. But his wife Opal still runs the general store. If anyone would know about her husband's business dealings, we can't confront her. If she was involved or knows who was, she'll just warn them. Then we need to find another way to identify V.D." Henrie thought for a moment. "The county records office. They keep marriage licenses, birth records, death certificates. If VD is someone who lived here in 1893, there'll be a record. It's too risky to go during the day. People are already suspicious. Then we go tonight, now." They gathered the ledger and the shipping manifest, extinguished their lanterns, and slipped out of the building. The county office was 2 blocks away, a small stone building that also housed the courthouse. The front door was locked, but Henrie had learned lockpicking from a prospector years ago. She worked the lock with a piece of wire while Arthur kept watch. The door opened. They entered and closed it behind them, moving through the dark building by feel. The records room was at the back, the same place Henrie had been the day before. This time, she knew exactly what she was looking for. She lit a small candle and began pulling down record books. Birth records from 1850 to 1880, sorted alphabetically. She started with D. There were dozens of entries. She ran her finger down the pages, looking for first names that started with V. Vernon, Vincent, Victoria, Vera, and then she found it. Vernon Drummond. Born March 3, 1845, son of Harold and Elizabeth Drummond. "Vernon Drummond," she whispered. "Horace's brother." Arthur leaned over her shoulder. "Does it say where he lives?" She checked the notation. "Last address listed is a homestead northwest of town, but these records are old. Is he still alive? I don't know. I've never heard anyone mention him." She thought about it. But Opal would know. Their family. They put the records back and left the building, locking the door behind them. It was nearly 3 in the morning. The town was silent, everyone asleep. "We need to be careful," Arthur said. "If Vernon Drummond is still alive and realizes we're looking into this, he might run, or worse. We need proof before we go to the authorities. The ledger helps, but it doesn't prove Vernon killed your uncle. We need something concrete." "Like what?" "Like Jackson's body. If we could find where he's actually buried, if there's evidence of murder." "You think he's still up on Broken Spine Ridge?" "I think someone took him there to kill him and make it look like an accident. Whether they moved the body after or left it there, I don't know. But if we can find the site where that blasting powder was used, we might find something." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tomorrow, at first light, we'll go up to the ridge and search." They separated. Arthur back to the boarding house, Henrie up the trail to her cabin. When she arrived, Bandit greeted her with worried whines. She sat on the porch and let him press against her legs, his warmth grounding her. Everything was falling into place, but it was an ugly picture. Horace Drummond and Tobias Kern had been on Intermountain's payroll, helping them defraud landowners. When Jackson had discovered the scheme, they'd brought in Vernon Drummond to handle it. Vernon had lured Jackson to the ridge, killed him, and possibly used explosives to destroy the evidence. And then they'd all kept silent for 30 years. The question was, why had Arthur Bellamy shown up now? What had triggered him to come looking after all this time? She thought about the photograph that had spilled from his suitcase, about the way Bandit had reacted, lunging at the bag with such intensity. What else had been in that suitcase? She thought back to the moment on the platform. The suitcase had torn open, clothes had scattered, but there had been a hidden compartment. The photograph had fallen from a false bottom. What if there had been something else in there? Something Bandit had smelled, something that had triggered his protective instincts. She needed to talk to Arthur again, needed to ask him directly what else he'd brought with him. But it would have to wait until morning. She went inside and tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jackson's face. Not the way he'd looked in the photograph, young and happy, but the way she imagined he must have looked in his final moments, afraid, betrayed, alone. She woke before dawn, fed Bandit, and prepared for the climb to Broken Spine Ridge. She packed water, dried meat, rope, and her hunting knife. She had no idea what they'd find up there, but she wanted to be ready. Arthur met her at the trailhead as the sun was rising. He looked as tired as she felt. "You ready for this?" he asked. "I've been ready for 30 years. They started up the mountain with Bandit leading the way. The trail was steep and rocky, winding through thick forest before opening into alpine meadows. It took them 3 hours to reach the base of Broken Spine Ridge. The ridge rose above them, like a broken wall, jagged spires of rock thrusting up against the sky. The stone was dark grey, fractured and unstable. Henrie had only been up here twice. Once, with Jackson, and once the day after he disappeared. "Where was his camp?" Arthur asked. She pointed to a flat area beneath an overhang. "There." The tent was set up in the shelter of those rocks. They climbed up to the site. There was nothing left of the camp now. 3 decades of weather had erased every trace. But Henrie remembered exactly where everything had been. "The blood was over there," she said, pointing to a cluster of boulders, "and his equipment was scattered all through here." Arthur walked the perimeter, examining the ground. Bandit moved ahead of them, nose to the earth, searching. Suddenly the dog stopped and began pawing at a section of scree at the base of a cliff. "What is it?" Henrie called. Bandit whined and continued digging. She and Arthur hurried over. The dog had uncovered something, old, weathered wood, part of a crate. Arthur knelt and began carefully moving rocks aside. More wood appeared, then metal, the remains of a detonation box. "They set off an explosion right here," he said, "probably to collapse this section of cliff and make it look like a rockfall. But where's the body?" Arthur stood and studied the cliff face. If they triggered the blast from here, the rocks would have come down on top of this whole area. If Jackson's body was here, it would be buried under tons of rubble. Henrie looked at the scree slope, thousands of rocks, from pebbles to boulders, that had accumulated over decades. "We need a crew with equipment to move all this. We can't do it ourselves. Then we'll have to bring the sheriff back here with men and tools." Arthur pulled out the ledger they'd taken from the timber office. "Between this, the shipping manifest, and what we found here, we have enough to open a formal investigation. Kern won't want to investigate. He's implicated. Then we'll go over his head. We'll contact the territorial authorities, have them send someone independent." A sound behind them made them both freeze. The unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," a voice said. They turned slowly. A man stood 20 feet away, a Winchester rifle aimed directly at them. He was old, 70 at least, with a weathered face and cold eyes that Henrie recognized even though she hadn't seen him in 30 years. Vernon Drummond. Vernon Drummond looked older than time itself, but his hands on the rifle were steady. He stood on higher ground, 20 feet away, with the morning sun at his back, making it hard to see his face clearly. But his voice was strong enough. "Been wondering when someone would finally come poking around up here. Figured it'd be you, Henrie. You always were the stubborn type." Henrie's mind raced. Bandit had gone still, sensing danger, a low growl building in his throat. She put a hand on his collar. "Vernon, it's been a long time, 30 years. You've aged some. So have you. Not enough, apparently. He shifted the rifle slightly, keeping them both in his sights. You should have stayed up in your cabin, kept your mouth shut like you've been doing all this time. But then this fellow showed up. He nodded at Arthur. And you just couldn't help yourself, could you? Arthur's voice was carefully controlled. You killed my uncle. I did. Clean shot through the heart, right over there where you're standing. He went down quick, didn't suffer. The casual admission hit Arthur like a physical blow. Henrie saw his hands clench into fists. Why? Arthur demanded. What did he do to deserve that? He was going to ruin everything. Your uncle was a smart man. I'll give him that. Too smart. He figured out what we were doing, figured out the whole operation. And he wasn't going to let it go. Said he had a moral obligation to report it. Vernon spat. Moral obligation. Like that means anything when there's money on the line? The timber fraud, Henrie said. Horace and Kern were on Intermountain's payroll, falsifying surveys so the company could buy land cheap. Not just Horace and Kern. Half the county government had their hands in it. Intermountain paid well, and everybody got rich. It was perfect until Jackson Lyle showed up and started asking questions. So you killed him. Horace asked me to handle it, said it needed to be permanent and untraceable. I was good at that kind of work, back in my younger days. Vernon's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing carpentry. I knew about him and you, Henrie. Everybody knew, even if they pretended not to. So I sent him a note saying you had the proof he needed, told him to meet you up here at dawn. He came alone, trusting, just like I figured he would. Henrie felt sick. All these years, she'd wondered how Jackson had been lured to his death. Now she knew, with her name, her trust, used as bait. And the explosion, Arthur asked, staged it to look like a mining accident. Brought up some blasting powder. Set charges to bring down part of the cliff. Made enough noise and rubble that nobody questioned what happened. Your uncle's body is under about 50 tons of rock right where you're standing. People searched, Henrie said. The sheriff organized search parties, and they found exactly what we wanted them to find. A destroyed camp, blood, signs of violence. We left just enough evidence to make it look like an animal attack or a mining accident. Then we had the case closed quick before anyone could look too close. Vernon's expression hardened. It worked for 30 years. Would have worked forever if you'd left well enough alone. You can't kill us, Arthur said. People know we're up here. If we don't come back, then it'll be another tragic accident. This ridge is dangerous, everyone knows that. Rockslides happen all the time. Two people climbing around where they shouldn't be, disturbing unstable ground. Well, that's just foolish. Folks will shake their heads and say what a shame it is, but they won't be surprised. Henrie's hand was still on Bandit's collar. The dog was tense, ready to spring. But Vernon was too far away. Even if Bandit attacked, Vernon would have time to shoot. Why are you here now? She asked, trying to keep him talking. How did you know we'd come up here today? Because I've been watching. When that Bellamy fellow showed up in town, with his questions and his photographs, I knew it was only a matter of time. So I kept an eye on him. Saw you two breaking into the old timber office last night. Saw you sneaking into the county records building. Followed you up the mountain this morning. He smiled, showing yellow teeth. I'm old, but I'm not dead yet. Arthur took a small step forward. You won't get away with this. We left evidence, documents, ledgers, which prove a crime from 30 years ago involving men who are mostly dead. Horace is gone. Sheriff Morrison retired and died years back. Even if someone believed you, even if they prosecuted, what would they get? An old man spending his last few years in prison? Vernon shook his head. I'm 78 years old. Got maybe 5 years left if I'm lucky. You think I care about consequences now? Then why kill us? Henrie asked. If you don't care about consequences, because I promised Horace I'd keep the secret. He was my brother, and he took care of me when nobody else would. This was his deal, his plan. I was just the tool he used. But I owed him, and I keep my promises. His finger tightened on the trigger. I'm sorry it has to be this way, Henrie. I always liked you, but you shouldn't have come looking for ghosts. In the moment before Vernon could fire, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from the rocks above. Put the rifle down, Vernon. Everyone froze. Henrie recognized the voice. Sheriff Tobias Kern. Vernon's eyes flicked upward, searching for the source, but he kept the rifle trained on Henrie and Arthur. "Stay out of this, Tobias. Can't do that. Not anymore." Kern emerged from behind a boulder higher up the slope, his own rifle in hand. He looked tired and old, but his aim was steady. "I followed you up here, Vernon. Figured you might do something stupid. You're in this as deep as I am. I know. And I've spent 30 years living with it. 30 years watching Henrie Daws hide away in those mountains because she was too scared to speak up about what happened. 30 years knowing we let a good man die because it was convenient." Kern's voice cracked. "I'm done carrying it, Vernon. I'm done. You put that rifle down, and these two go straight to the authorities. They've got the ledgers, they've got shipping records. It'll all come out. Your name, Horace's name, everyone who was involved. You'll be ruined. I'm already ruined. Have been for 30 years. Kern moved down the slope, keeping his rifle aimed at Vernon. "Now, put your weapon down before someone else dies on this mountain." Vernon's expression shifted. The cold certainty left his eyes, replaced by something desperate. "I won't go to prison, Tobias. I told you that. I'd rather die right here than die," Kern said quietly. "But you're not taking anyone else with you." For a long, terrible moment, nothing moved. The wind stirred dust and pine needles. A hawk circled overhead, indifferent to the drama below. Then Vernon's shoulders sagged. The rifle lowered just an inch. "I'm tired," he said. "I've been tired for 30 years. I know." Vernon looked at Henrie, then at Arthur. "Your uncle was a good man. Better than any of us. He deserved better than what he got." "Yes," Arthur said. "He did." Vernon set the rifle down on the ground and raised his hands. "All right, Tobias. I'm done fighting." Kern descended carefully, keeping his weapon ready until he was close enough to kick Vernon's rifle away. Then he pulled out a set of handcuffs, old, tarnished, probably the same ones he'd used as a young deputy, and secured Vernon's wrists. Only when it was done did Henrie let herself breathe. "You followed him," she said to Kern. "I followed you, both of you. I knew where this was heading." Kern looked at the scree slope where Jackson Lyle's body lay buried. "I should have stopped it 30 years ago. I should have stood up to them, refused to be part of it. But I was young and scared, and I told myself it wasn't my problem to solve." "You're helping now," Arthur said. "That counts for something. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just an old man trying to buy back some piece of his soul before it's too late." Kern pulled Vernon to his feet. "Come on! We've got a long walk back down, and you've got a story to tell. All of it, every detail. You're going to answer for what you did." Vernon nodded wearily. "I know, and I will. Just one thing." "What?" "Tell Opal I'm sorry. Tell her I did what I thought was right for the family, but I was wrong." "Tell her I'm sorry." Kern's expression softened just slightly. "I'll tell her." They started down the mountain, Kern holding Vernon's arm to steady him on the steep trail. Henrie and Arthur followed, Bandit between them. The dog kept looking back at the scree slope, whining softly, as if he understood that someone lay buried there, still waiting to be brought home. As they descended, Arthur said quietly, "Your sheriff, he's going to prison too, isn't he?" "Probably. He was part of it. He took money, witnessed false documents, helped cover up a murder." Henrie paused. "But he also stopped Vernon from killing us. He could have let it happen, could have kept the secret buried. He chose differently. Will that be enough? I don't know. But it's more than he's done in 30 years. They reached the base of the mountain as the sun reached its peak. From there they could see Calico Ridge spread out below, the sagging buildings, the dusty street, the people going about their ordinary lives. Unaware that everything was about to change, Henrie thought about Jackson, about the young woman she'd been when she loved him, about all the years she'd spent hiding from the truth. She thought about the price of silence and the cost of finally breaking it, and she thought about what came next: testimony, investigations, trials. The whole ugly story dragged into daylight, but at least Jackson would finally get justice. At least his nephew would know what happened and why. At least the lies were finally over. They brought Vernon Drummond down the mountain in the late afternoon light. 4 people, walking in silence, with the weight of 3 decades pressing on their shoulders. When they reached Calico Ridge, people stopped what they were doing and stared. Word spread fast the way it always did in small towns. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, half the town had gathered in the street. Deputy Lyle Pritchard was waiting on the steps. His face registered shock when he saw Vernon in handcuffs and Sheriff Kern walking beside him with slumped shoulders. "Sheriff? What's going on?" Kern didn't answer immediately. He led Vernon inside and locked him in the single cell at the back of the office. Only when the door was secured did he turn to face his deputy. "Sit down, Lyle. We need to talk." "Sir, I don't understand." "I said sit down." The younger man obeyed. Henrie and Arthur stood near the door, uncertain whether they should leave or stay. Kern gestured for them to remain. "What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything you think you know about this town and about me," Kern began. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he took off his hat and set it on the desk. 30 years ago, I helped cover up a murder. Jackson Lyle, the surveyor who disappeared in 1893, didn't die in an accident. He was killed by Vernon Drummond on the orders of Horace Drummond, and I knew about it. I witnessed false land transfers, accepted bribes from Intermountain Timber Company, and helped close the case before a real investigation could happen. Lyle's face went pale. "That's not you wouldn't—" "I did. I was 20 years old and scared of losing my job, scared of what would happen if I went against powerful men. So I stayed quiet and told myself it was the right thing for the town, for the economy, for everyone's livelihood. I told myself one man's life didn't matter as much as the prosperity of the whole community." Kern's voice broke. "I was wrong. And I've been wrong for 30 years. The deputy looked at Henrie, then at Arthur, searching for some indication this was a mistake. But their faces confirmed everything. "My father," Lyle said quietly. "His notes, the ones my mother kept. He knew, didn't he?" "He suspected. He was a better man than I was. He wanted to keep investigating, but he was told to stand down, same as me. The difference is he never forgot. He carried that guilt until the day he died." Kern met Lyle's eyes. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way. And I'm sorry your father's suspicions were right. What happens now?" "Now I'm going to write out a full confession. Every detail, every person involved, every dollar I took. Then I'm going to send it to the territorial authorities, along with the evidence Mr. Bellamy and Miss Daws recovered. There'll be an investigation, a trial. Vernon will go to prison, and so will I. Sheriff, there's no other way, Lyle. This has to end. Jackson Lyle deserves justice, even if it's 30 years late." Kern picked up a pen. "You're in charge now. Act as interim sheriff until they send someone from Helena to take over. Keep the peace. Don't let people turn on each other. This town has already paid a high price for what happened. Don't let it tear itself apart." Lyle stood slowly, his face a mix of confusion and betrayal and grief. "Yes, sir." Henrie watched the young deputy walk out, his shoulders rigid. She understood what he was feeling. The ground shifting beneath your feet, everything solid becoming uncertain. She'd felt that way on the train platform when the photograph had spilled out. "You did the right thing," she told Kern. "I did what I should have done 30 years ago." He looked at her with tired eyes. "I'm sorry, Henrie. Sorry you carried this alone all these years. Sorry I didn't protect you when I should have. We all made choices. Some of them were wrong. But we're here now, and the truth is finally coming out." Arthur had been silent, standing near the window and looking out at the street where people were still gathered, talking in hushed voices. Now he turned and said, "I need to go up there, to the ridge. I need to bring my uncle home. That'll take equipment," Kern said. "Men with shovels and picks. It'll be a hard dig. Those rocks have been settled for 30 years. I don't care how hard it is. He's been up there long enough. I'll organize it. Soon as I finish this confession, I'll get a crew together. We'll go up at first light tomorrow." Arthur nodded, then left. Henrie moved to follow, but Kern stopped her. "Wait, there's something else." She turned back. "What?" "Vernon said he'd been watching you. Said he followed you and Arthur last night when you broke into the timber office. But I don't think that's the whole story." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Vernon's been living like a hermit for the past 10 years, out on a homestead 20 miles from here. He barely comes to town. So how did he know Arthur Bellamy showed up? How did he know to start watching? And Kern leaned forward. Someone told him. Someone in town is still protecting the secret. Henrie felt a chill run down her spine. Who? I don't know. But Vernon had family, Horace's widow, Opal. Their children scattered years ago, but Opal's still here, still running the store. And she was married to Horace for 40 years. You think she didn't know what he was involved in? You're saying Opal knew about the murder? I'm saying she knew something. And when Arthur showed up asking questions, she might have sent word to Vernon. Kern's expression was grim, which means she might try to interfere with what's happening now. Destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, I don't know. But you need to be careful. Henrie thought about Opal Drummond, stern, opinionated, fiercely protective of family. If she'd known about Vernon's crime, if she'd spent 30 years keeping that secret, she wouldn't give up easily. I'll be careful, Henrie promised. She left the office and walked through town with Bandit at her side. People stared, some with curiosity, others with hostility. She heard whispers. She's the one who brought all this up. Should have left it buried. Now look what's happened. She kept walking head high. Let them whisper. Let them judge. The truth was more important than their comfort. She found Arthur at the boarding house, sitting on the porch with his uncle's journal. He looked up when she approached. You all right? She asked. No, but I will be. Once we bring him home, once he's properly buried, I'll be all right. He closed the journal. I keep reading his entries, trying to understand what he was thinking those last few days. He knew he was in danger. He wrote about feeling watched, about suspecting someone was following him. But he couldn't stop. He said truth mattered more than safety. He was right, was he? He's dead, and the people who killed him got away with it for 30 years. What good did truth do him? It's doing good now. Because of him. Because of what he discovered and documented, we're finally able to bring justice. That matters. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I lied to you. About what? About why I came here. About what was in my suitcase that made your dog attack. He took a breath. I had a gun. A revolver. I brought it because I thought if I found the person who killed my uncle, I don't know. I wanted options. Wanted to feel like I had some power. Henrie sat down beside him. Did you plan to use it? I thought about it. All the way on the train, I kept thinking about what I'd do if I found the killer. Would I turn them over to the law, or would I handle it myself? He shook his head. Your dog smelled the gun oil, I think. That's why he lunged. He was protecting you from a threat. Good dog. Yeah, Arthur managed a small smile. When Kern pulled that rifle on Vernon today, when I saw how easy it would be to just shoot him and end it, I was glad I didn't have my gun with me, because I might have used it, and that wouldn't have been justice. That would have just been more killing. You're not a killer, Arthur. Neither was your uncle. But Vernon is, and he'll answer for what he did. They sat in silence as the sun set and the mountain shadows crept down into the valley. Eventually Arthur said, Will you come with us tomorrow? When we go to recover the body? Yes, I owe him that much. I owe him more than that, but it's what I can give. That night, Henrie didn't go back to her cabin. She took a room at the boarding house, not wanting to be alone in the mountains with everything that was happening. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the town, horses in the street, voices from the saloon, the distant whistle of a late train. Tomorrow, they'd go back up to Broken Spine Ridge. They'd move tons of rock and find what remained of Jackson Lyle. They'd bring him down and give him a proper burial. They'd honor the man he'd been and the truth he'd died trying to expose. But tonight, in the dark, Henrie allowed herself to remember him as he'd been, young and alive and full of hope. She remembered his laugh, the way he'd looked at her like she mattered, the plans they'd made for a future that never came. She cried for the first time in 30 years. Not silent tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place she'd kept locked away for too long. She cried for Jackson, for herself, for all the wasted years and lost possibilities. When she finally slept, she dreamed of mountains and justice, and a young man's smile that death hadn't quite erased. Morning came cold and clear. Henrie woke to find a note slipped under her door. It was from Opal Drummond, written in her precise script. "We need to talk. Come to the store before you go up the mountain, please." Henrie dressed and went downstairs. Arthur was already up, drinking coffee and looking out at the street, where Deputy Pritchard was organizing the crew for the recovery operation. A dozen men with shovels and picks preparing for hard work. "I got a note from Opal," Henrie said. Arthur tensed. "What did it say?" "She wants to talk. Before we go up the ridge. It could be a trap, it could be. But I need to know what she knows." Henrie finished her coffee. "I'll meet you at the trailhead in an hour. If I'm not there, come looking. Henrie, I'll be careful. I promise." She left the boarding house and walked to the general store. It wasn't open yet, but the door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. Opal was waiting behind the counter, her face carved from stone. "Close the door," she said. Henrie did. Bandit pressed against her leg, alert. "You've stirred up a lot of trouble," Opal began. "I didn't stir it up. It was already there, buried under 30 years of lies. Vernon's been arrested. Tobias has confessed to taking bribes. The whole town is talking. Do you understand what this means? Do you understand what you've done to us? I understand that a man was murdered, and justice was delayed for 3 decades. I understand that the truth matters more than your comfort." Opal's hands gripped the counter edge. "My husband was a good man. He provided for this town, gave people jobs, kept the economy going when the mines started failing. What he did with Intermountain, that was business. Just business. Murder isn't business. Horace didn't kill anyone. Vernon did that on his own. Horace ordered it. That makes him just as guilty." Opal's face crumpled. For a moment, she looked old and frightened. "I know, God help me, I know. I've known since the day it happened. Horace came home that night, and I could see it in his eyes. Something terrible had occurred. I didn't ask, and he didn't tell, but I knew, and you said nothing. He was my husband. What was I supposed to do? Turn him in? Destroy our life, our family? I had children to think about." She took a shaky breath. "I made a choice. Maybe it was the wrong choice, but it's the one I made. And I've lived with it every day since. Why did you want to see me? Because I need you to understand something. Vernon's going to prison and he deserves it. Tobias too. But don't think this ends there. This town is built on those deals Horace made. Half the businesses, half the property holdings, they all trace back to land acquired through that scheme. If the authorities dig deep enough, they'll unravel everything. They'll question every title, every deed. People will lose their homes, their livelihoods. That's not my problem. It will be when they blame you for it. When they see you as the woman who destroyed everything because you couldn't let the past stay buried." Henrie met her eyes. "I've been blamed for worse, and I'd rather be blamed for telling the truth than for hiding it." She turned to leave, but Opal's voice stopped her. "One more thing. Vernon's not the only one who knows how to keep secrets. There are others who were involved, others who profited. If they think you're a threat, they'll come after you. Is that a threat? It's a warning. Be careful, Henrie. Justice is a fine thing, but it doesn't stop bullets." Henrie left the store with her heart pounding and Bandit close beside her. Arthur was waiting at the trailhead with Deputy Pritchard and the crew. They loaded equipment onto pack mules and started up the mountain as the sun climbed above the eastern peaks. The climb took hours. When they finally reached Broken Spine Ridge, everyone stopped to rest and drink water. Henrie stood at the edge of the scree slope, looking at the tons of rock that had buried Jackson Lyle. "This is where we dig," she said, and the work began. They worked through the morning, 12 men moving rocks one by one, careful not to disturb the slope too much for fear of triggering a collapse. It was hard, dangerous labor. The sun beat down and sweat soaked through their shirts. Hands bled, backs ached, but no one complained. Henrie worked alongside them, hauling smaller stones, fetching water, doing whatever needed doing. Arthur was tireless, moving rock after rock with grim determination. Bandit stayed nearby, watching and occasionally whining when Henrie got too close to unstable ground. By noon, they'd cleared enough to expose older, more stable rock underneath. Deputy Pritchard called for a break. The men collapsed in the shade, drinking water and eating the food they'd packed. Henrie sat beside Arthur on a flat boulder. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? They were digging for a body, for proof of a crime, for the physical remains of a man they'd both loved in different ways. After 15 minutes, they went back to work. The afternoon wore on. The pile of removed stones grew larger, and then, as the sun started its descent toward the western peaks, one of the men called out, "Found something!" Everyone stopped. The man, a miner named Cole, who'd volunteered for the crew, was kneeling at the edge of the excavation. He'd uncovered fabric, rotted and discolored, but still recognizable as clothing. Arthur moved forward, his face white. Henrie grabbed his arm. "Let them work. Don't look until they're done. I need to see. You will. But let them do this properly. Let them treat him with respect." Arthur nodded jerkily and stepped back. Deputy Pritchard and 2 others worked carefully, removing stones from around the body with gentle hands. It took another hour. When they finally had it fully exposed, everyone fell silent. Jackson Lyle had been buried face down, arms outstretched, as if he'd been trying to climb when the rocks had come down. His surveying vest was still intact, the pockets containing his notebook and instruments. His bones were scattered and broken, crushed by the weight of stone. But his skull was intact, and in the left side of it, clearly visible, was a bullet hole. Deputy Pritchard examined it carefully. Entry wound at the back, exit through the front. He was shot from behind. Arthur's breath came in short gasps. Henrie put a hand on his shoulder and felt him trembling. "He trusted someone," Arthur said. "Whoever did this, my uncle trusted them enough to turn his back on them." "Vernon admitted to the shooting," Pritchard said. "This confirms it. We've got physical evidence now, along with his confession." They wrapped the remains in canvas and secured them to a pack mule. The sun was low now, the shadows long. No one wanted to spend the night on the mountain, so they packed up quickly and started down. The descent was harder than the climb. Everyone was exhausted, and the trail was treacherous in the fading light. Henrie walked beside the mule carrying Jackson's body, unable to shake the feeling that she owed him some kind of vigil. They reached Calico Ridge after dark. Word had already spread that they'd found the body, and people lined the street as they passed. Some removed their hats. Others just stared. A few turned away, unable or unwilling to face the physical proof of what had been done. They took the remains to the undertaker, a somber man named Garrett, who promised to treat them with all due care and respect. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching as the canvas-wrapped bundle was carried inside. "He can't have a proper funeral until after the trial," Pritchard said. "He's evidence now. But once that's done, once Vernon's been convicted, we'll bury him properly. With a marker and everything. He should be buried on the ridge," Arthur said. He loved those mountains. He wrote about them in his journal, how beautiful they were, how peaceful. He'd want to rest there. "We'll make sure of it," Henrie promised. They left the undertakers and walked through the quiet town. Most people had gone inside, but Henrie could feel eyes watching from windows. The whole valley knew now. The secret was out, spread across every dinner table and whispered in every corner. Tomorrow, officials would arrive from Helena. There would be interviews, statements, formal investigations. The story would spread beyond Calico Ridge to the territorial newspapers and beyond. People would be held accountable. Lives would be ruined. But tonight, all Henrie could think about was Jackson Lyle, finally found, finally freed from his grave of stones. She thought about the young man he'd been, about the justice he'd sought and the price he'd paid for it. She thought about Vernon Drummond sitting in a cell, waiting for judgment, about Tobias Kern writing his confession with shaking hands, about Opal Drummond lying awake in the dark, facing what her husband had done. And she thought about herself, about the woman she'd been 30 years ago and the woman she'd become through silence and fear, about whether she'd finally paid her debt, or if some debts could never fully be repaid. "You should rest," Arthur said, breaking her reverie. "We all should. Tomorrow's going to be hard. Every tomorrow's been hard for 30 years. This one won't be any different. Yes, it will. Because tomorrow the truth is official. Tomorrow justice begins," Henrie nodded. They parted ways, Arthur to the boarding house, Henrie to the small room she'd rented. She climbed the stairs slowly, feeling every one of her 62 years. Inside, she lit a lamp and sat on the bed. Bandit lay at her feet, exhausted. She pulled out Jackson's pocket watch, the one she'd kept hidden for 3 decades. The metal was tarnished, the glass cracked, the hands frozen at 10 minutes past 8. She wound it gently, carefully. To her surprise, it began to tick, faint but steady, a mechanical heart beating after all these years of silence. She held it to her ear and listened to the sound of time moving forward again. The territorial marshal arrived from Helena 2 days later on the morning train. His name was Samuel Garrett, no relation to the undertaker, and he was a man in his 50s with grey at his temples and eyes that had seen too much. He spent the first day interviewing everyone involved: Vernon Drummond in his cell, Sheriff Kern at his desk, Arthur Bellamy at the boarding house, and finally Henrie at a table in the empty saloon. "Tell me everything," Garrett said, his pen poised over a notebook. "Start from the beginning," so she did. She told him about meeting Jackson at the logging camp in 1893, about their relationship, about his investigation into the timber fraud. She told him about his disappearance, about finding the destroyed camp and the pocket watch. She told him about 30 years of silence and guilt. Garrett listened without interrupting, taking notes in careful script. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at her for a long moment. "You kept evidence of a crime for 3 decades. Yes, you withheld information from a murder. Investigation. Yes, you could be charged as an accessory after the fact." "I know." Henrie met his eyes steadily. "But I'm telling the truth now. That has to count for something." Garrett leaned back in his chair. "Miss Daws, I've been a lawman for 26 years. I've seen every kind of crime and every kind of criminal, and I've learned that the worst crimes aren't always the ones committed in violence. Sometimes they're the ones committed through silence, the ones where good people stand by and let evil happen because they're too afraid to speak up. I know that. I've lived with it, but you're speaking up now. That takes courage, even if it's 30 years late." He picked up his pen again. "I'm not going to charge you. Your testimony is too valuable, and frankly, I think you've punished yourself more than any court could. But I need you to understand something. This case is going to be difficult. Vernon Drummond will go to prison, that's certain. The physical evidence and his confession make that airtight. But convicting the others, the ones who were part of the fraud but didn't pull the trigger, that's harder. Some of them are dead. Some of them will deny everything. And some people in this town will protect them because they've been protecting them for years. You mean Opal Drummond, among others. I've already had 3 prominent citizens come to my hotel room suggesting that it would be better for everyone if this investigation stayed focused on Vernon alone. They're offering me inducements to keep it narrow. Bribes. That's a strong word, but yes. Which tells me they're scared. Which tells me there's more to uncover." Garrett stood. "I'll be here for at least a month, maybe longer. I'm going to interview everyone who was in Calico Ridge in 1893. I'm going to examine every land transfer, every document, every financial record I can find. And I'm going to need your help. Are you willing to testify at trial?" "Yes. Even if it means standing in a courtroom and admitting your relationship with Jackson Lyle. Even if it means having your private life examined and judged. I've been judged for 30 years. I can handle more of it." "Good. Because this is going to get worse before it gets better." He was right. Over the next week, the investigation deepened and widened. Marshal Garrett brought in additional deputies from Helena. They seized documents from the county records office, from Opal Drummond's store, from the homes of anyone connected to the old timber deals. They interviewed dozens of people, some cooperative, others hostile. The town began to fracture. Those who'd benefited from the intermountain deals, directly or indirectly, closed ranks and refused to cooperate. Those who'd lost land or been cheated demanded justice and accountability. Arguments broke out in the streets. The saloon saw 3 fights in 1 week. Through it all, Henrie stayed in town, available for questions, refusing to hide. She endured hostile stares and whispered accusations. Someone threw a rock through her boarding house window. Someone else left a dead rat on the doorstep with a note, "Go back to your mountain." Arthur stayed too, driven by the same stubborn determination that had brought him here in the first place. Together, they became the visible faces of the investigation. the ones people blamed or thanked, depending on which side they fell on. Vernon Drummond remained in his cell, silent now, no longer willing to talk. His confession stood on the record, but he refused to name others who'd been involved. Loyalty to his dead brother, or maybe just exhaustion with the whole business. Sheriff Kern had resigned officially and was waiting for his own trial. He spent his days in a rented room, writing letters to people he'd wronged, trying to make what amends he could. Deputy Pritchard had taken over as interim sheriff and was doing his best to keep the peace in a town that was tearing itself apart. One evening, Henrie was sitting on the porch of the boarding house when Opal Drummond appeared. She looked older than she had a week ago, worn down by the weight of everything that was coming out. "May I sit?" Opal asked. Henrie gestured to the empty chair. Opal sat with a sigh. "I'm leaving," she said after a moment. "Selling the store. Leaving Calico Ridge. I can't stay here anymore. Not with everyone knowing what Horace did, what I knew about. Where will you go?" "I have a sister in Idaho. She's offered to take me in." Opal was quiet for a moment. "I came to tell you I'm sorry. Not for protecting my husband. I'd do that again. But for letting you carry the burden alone all these years. I knew you'd been involved with Jackson Lyle. I knew you were grieving. I could have reached out, could have offered some kind of comfort. Instead, I stayed silent and let you suffer." "We all stayed silent," Henrie said. "We all made choices. Yes, but some choices were worse than others." Opal stood. "I hope you find peace, Henrie. I hope this all brings you some kind of peace." She walked away into the gathering darkness. Henrie watched her go, thinking about forgiveness and accountability and whether the two could ever truly coexist. The next morning, Arthur came to find her. "Marshal Garrett wants to see us. He says he's found something important." Marshal Garrett had set up his temporary office in the courthouse. When Henrie and Arthur arrived, he was standing over a table covered with documents, ledgers, and correspondence. He looked up with something like satisfaction in his eyes. "I found the full list," he said without preamble. "Everyone who took money from Intermountain Timber. 8 names total, including Horace Drummond and Tobias Kern. 2 are dead, 1 moved to California 15 years ago, but the other 5 are still in the territory. I've issued warrants for their arrest. Will they go to trial?" Arthur asked. "Yes, it won't be quick and it won't be easy, but yes. The evidence is solid. Between the ledgers you found, Jackson Lyle's journal, the physical evidence from the grave, and Vernon's confession, we have enough to prosecute." Garrett paused. "There's something else. I found a letter in the Intermountain files, correspondence between the company and Horace Drummond. It was written 3 days before Jackson was killed. Horace explicitly states that the surveyor problem will be handled permanently. That's proof of premeditation, proof that Horace ordered the hit." Henrie felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, but closure. After 30 years of wondering, of carrying guilt and uncertainty, here was the truth in black and white. Horace had ordered it. Vernon had carried it out, and everyone else had been complicit in the cover-up. "What about the town?" she asked. "What happens to Calico Ridge?" "That's more complicated. The land deals were fraudulent, but unwinding them after 30 years would create chaos. My recommendation to the territorial government will be to let the current property arrangements stand, but to establish a compensation fund for the families who were cheated. Not perfect justice, but practical justice." Garrett closed the ledger he'd been reviewing. "The trials will take most of a year. I'll need both of you to testify. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes," they said together. "Good, because the defense attorneys will try to tear you apart. They'll say you had a motive to fabricate evidence, that you're seeking revenge or attention. They'll bring up your relationship with Jackson, Miss Daws, and they'll try to suggest you were somehow complicit in his death. You need to be ready for that." "I've been ready for 30 years, Henrie said quietly. "The trials began in the spring. Vernon Drummond was tried first, convicted in 3 days, and sentenced to life in prison. He was 78 years old. Everyone knew he'd die there. Tobias Kern was tried next. His case was more complicated because he'd ultimately cooperated with the investigation, but the jury still found him guilty of corruption and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 5 years. He served 3 before dying of a heart attack in the territorial prison. The other cases took longer, dragging through the summer and into fall. 3 were convicted, 2 were acquitted for lack of evidence. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than Henrie had dared hope for. Through it all, she testified. She stood in courtrooms and told the truth about Jackson Lyle, about their relationship, about what she'd known and what she'd hidden. She endured hostile questioning and public judgment, but she also saw justice done, slowly and imperfectly, but done nonetheless. Arthur stayed in Montana throughout the trials. When they were finally over, when all the verdicts had been rendered and all the sentences passed, he came to find Henrie at her cabin. She'd moved back up to the mountain after the first trial ended, needing the solitude and distance from town. Arthur hiked up with supplies and a proposition. "I'm staying," he said, as they sat on her porch, watching the sun set over the valley. "I've bought land down near Calico Ridge, going to build a house, start a timber operation, legitimate this time, everything above board." "Why?" Henrie asked. "You could go back east, back to your family, because this is where my uncle died. And I think he'd want someone from his family here, making sure what happened to him never happens to anyone else." Arthur paused. "Also, I like it here. The mountains, the space, the way things move slow but deliberate. It suits me. It's a hard life, I know, but worth it, I think." They were quiet for a while. Then Arthur said, "There's going to be a memorial service for Jackson and for all the people who were cheated or hurt by what happened. Deputy Pritchard is organizing it. He asked if you'd come." "When?" "Next Sunday. Up on Broken Spine Ridge, where we found him. They're placing a marker there." Henrie nodded. "I'll be there." The memorial was simple. About 30 people made the climb. Arthur, Deputy Pritchard, Marshal Garrett, Mrs. Pritchard, and others whose families had been affected. They stood in a circle around a granite marker that read, "Jackson Lyle, 1863-1893. He sought truth and paid the price. May his courage inspire justice." Pritchard said a few words about duty and honor. Arthur spoke about his uncle's love of these mountains and his commitment to doing what was right. And then, unexpectedly, he turned to Henrie. "Would you say something?" She hadn't prepared anything. But she stepped forward and looked at the marker, at the name carved in stone, and the words came. Jackson believed people were good. He believed in truth and fairness and the idea that we all owe each other honesty. He died because he wouldn't compromise those beliefs. For 30 years, I compromised them for him by staying silent. But he's not silent anymore. None of us are. And maybe that's the real memorial, not this stone, but the fact that we finally spoke up. That we finally gave him the justice he was owed. She placed Jackson's pocket watch at the base of the marker. It was still ticking, keeping time after all these years. "Rest easy," she whispered. They descended the mountain as the sun set, bathing the peaks in gold and red. Back in Calico Ridge, life was returning to something like normal. Opal had left, her store sold to a family from Helena. A new sheriff had been appointed, a fair man with no connection to the old corruption. The town was smaller now, diminished by the scandal, but perhaps more honest. Henrie returned to her cabin, to her solitary life, but it felt different now. The weight she'd carried was gone. She could breathe freely. She could look at the mountains without seeing ghosts. Bandit grew old beside her. Arthur visited often, sometimes bringing news from town, sometimes just sitting quietly on her porch. They never spoke about becoming more than friends. They were both too marked by the past for that, but they became something like family, bound by shared history and shared loss. Years passed. The story of Jackson Lyle and the Calico Ridge corruption became legend, the kind of tale people told to illustrate the importance of speaking truth to power. The details got embellished, the timeline compressed, but the core remained. A good man killed for doing right, and justice delayed, but ultimately delivered. Henrie lived to see her 70th birthday. On that day, she climbed one last time to Broken Spine Ridge and stood at Jackson's marker. The pocket watch was gone, taken by time or weather, or perhaps some passerby who needed it more than the dead. But the words remained. Carved deep, he sought truth and paid the price. She touched the stone gently. "I kept my promise," she said, to the wind and the mountains and the memory of a young man's smile. "I told the truth." "I hope that's enough," the wind answered with silence. But somehow that was enough too. She descended the mountain one last time, her faithful dog beside her, and returned to her cabin, where the fire was warm and the coffee was strong and the past, at last, could finally rest.